Welcome back to our special series on Rui Huang's masterpiece, 1587, A Year of No Significance. In our last explainer, we saw how the majestic Ming Empire began to stall under the weight of its own traditions. But history isn't just about dates, it's really about the people trapped inside the system. Today, we're going to turn our focus to one of those people, a man who tried to navigate these treacherous waters, Grand Secretary Shen Shih-hsing. How did one person's choices, or maybe his failures, end up shaping the destiny of millions? Let's dive right back into the heart of the 16th century Forbidden City. All right, so let's start with the man himself, Shen Shih-hsing. This quote right here, it gets to the very heart of who he was. Think of him as the ultimate manager, not some kind of revolutionary. He wasn't trying to tear the whole thing down. His entire career was about patching the cracks, oiling the gears, and just trying to keep the immense, creaking machinery of the Ming dynasty from grinding to a complete halt. So let's talk about that title, the Great Reconciler. How does a guy get a name like that? Well, to really get a handle on Shen Shih-hsing, you've got to look at the giant shadow he was stepping into, the shadow of the man who came before him, the formidable Chang Chü-cheng. I mean, look at this. You could not find two more different styles of leadership. Chang Chü-cheng was a force of nature, a total iron fist. His philosophy was that anything standing in the way of reform, even something beautiful like an orchid, had to be ruthlessly chopped down. And then you have Shen Shih-hsing. He was the complete opposite, the velvet glove. His whole approach wasn't about confrontation. It was about compromise, sincerity, and trying to build trust. You have to understand, Zhang's reforms were like an earthquake that rattled the entire bureaucracy. Then, his dramatic fall from grace left the court completely fractured and frankly paranoid. So the system didn't need another revolutionary. No way. What it needed was a healer. Someone who could bring people together. And Shen Shih-hsing, with his calm, steady style, seemed like the perfect man for an incredibly difficult job. But what kind of system was he trying to hold together? This is where things get really fascinating and really, really complicated. You got to get your head around this because it's so different from how we think about government today. The Ming Empire wasn't run by a big book of laws. There wasn't some detailed legal code for every little thing. Instead, it was all governed by a shared understanding of Confucian morality. The whole government was supposed to be an ethical institution, and the officials were expected to be virtuous gentlemen who would just, naturally do the right thing. But underneath that shiny surface of moral ideals, the real game was all about personal connections. It was a web of unwritten rules, where you were from, who you took the big exam with, who your family married into. These loyalties often mattered way more than your official job title. And all this created these powerful, competing factions, constantly jockeying for influence. And Shen totally got this. He saw this fundamental contradiction, this split personality, in everyone. Every official was basically wearing two masks. You had the public face, the yang, where they'd talk about virtue and serving the empire. But then there was the private face, the yin, which was all about their personal ambitions and these complex loyalties. Shen's entire job was a balancing act, appeal to their public virtue while carefully navigating their private interests. Now, let's just pause for a second and zoom out, because this is wild. In this exact same year, 1587, while the Ming court is tangled up in moral debates and factional drama, Philip II of Spain is building the Spanish Armada. The contrast is just stunning. You have one empire looking inward, obsessed with perfecting its moral order, while another is building one of the largest naval fleets in history to project its power across the ocean. It just shows you how different their worlds and their priorities really were. So you've got this system that's a mess of personal loyalties, and you've got an emperor who's basically clocking out. How in the world do you run an empire like that?
Yeah, he had to do it all while serving this man, the Wanli Emperor. And by 1587, Wanli was just done. He was sick of the endless rituals, tired of the constant bickering. He was starting his famous retreat from public life, basically becoming a ghost in his own palace.
So this becomes Shen's massive dilemma. What do? You can't just issue orders and say the emperor signed off if the emperor won't even see you. You have to keep up the whole illusion that the emperor is in charge while you're the one actually and very subtly trying to steer the ship of state. It's an impossible job. Okay, here's a perfect example of how Shen operated. The emperor gets this idea in his head that he wants to hold military drills with his eunuch troops inside the Forbidden City. The scholar officials are horrified. They think it's a total disaster. A big public fight would have been awful for everyone. So what does Shen do? He doesn't argue with the emperor. No. He goes through the back door. He quietly talks to the powerful eunuchs and convinces them that these drills might be a little, risky for the emperor's personal safety. The eunuchs get spooked, they convince the emperor it's a bad idea, and the plan is dropped. Problem solved, no fight, crisis averted. Brilliant, right? That was Shen's signature move. But here's the thing about always trying to keep the peace. All this compromise, this focus on harmony, it doesn't come for free. There's always a cost, and Shen's philosophy was constantly being put to the test. Take the Grand Scrutiny of 1587. This was basically a big performance review for every official in the capital. The moral hardliners saw this as their chance to purge all their enemies. Shen, on the other hand, saw a political bloodbath coming that could tear the government apart. So what did he do? He basically lowered the bar and made the evaluations really lenient. His thinking was pragmatic. It's better to keep the government running, even with a few mediocre guys, than to shatter the whole thing with ideological witch hunts. But to his critics, man, it just looked weak and unprincipled. And you see the same playbook with actual life or death crises. When the Yellow River was threatening to flood, a massive logistical challenge, Shen's #1 focus wasn't just engineering, it was people. He spent most of his energy carefully picking the officials who would manage the project, not just based on who was the most competent, but on who could actually get along with the other factions. For Shen, the political solution had to come before the technical one. Get the people right, and then maybe, just maybe, you could get the work done. But you can only bend so far before you break. And in a system this brittle, a system built on moral absolutes and unwritten rules, the art of compromise can only get you so far. Sooner or later, you're going to hit a wall, a problem that just can't be smoothed over. And that wall was the imperial succession. The emperor's favorite concubine has a son, and suddenly there's a huge crisis over who's going to be the next emperor. The bureaucracy? They're all about tradition. They demand he name his eldest son as the heir. But the emperor? He personally likes the younger kid better, and he just refuses. This was it, the one issue with zero room for compromise. And Shen got caught right in the middle, trying to mediate in secret. When his memos were leaked, it was over. He lost the trust of the emperor and the officials. He had nowhere to go and was forced to resign. The saddest part is that Shen saw it coming. Even back in 1587, while he was desperately trying to hold everything together, he wrote this in a private letter. He knew. He could see that the deep divisions, the emperor checking out, the rigid moralizing from the officials, he knew these were all symptoms of a terminal disease inside the state itself. And that, right there, is the real tragedy of Shen Shih-hsing. He wasn't a failure. He played the game of Ming politics better than almost anyone. He was a master of managing egos and balancing factions. You could say he was a master player in a game that was rigged to lose. At the end of the day, it didn't matter how good he was. The game itself was broken. So his career leaves us with this huge, timeless question, one that's just as relevant today as it was 400 years ago. When you're faced with a system that is fundamentally broken, what's the right move? Is it better to be the pragmatist, the compromiser, who tries to keep the lights on even if it means bending your principles? Or is that act of compromise just a weakness, something that only prolongs the inevitable collapse? It's a tough question, and it's one we're all still wrestling with.